Great. Thanks, Jeff. Um, so Wayne Honeycutt fell ill and so is not here to talk about the Soil Health Institute. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the interactions of soil health and drainage control, and then introduce a postdoc at the Soil Health Institute as well, who's just going to take a couple minutes and tell us a little bit about what he's up to. So this is just a few excerpts from a talk I gave in Ohio, just to say that we basically talk about soil health and drainage on a semi-regular basis, and we've talked about it in this group, but never really known quite what we want to do about it. So I'm just going to raise the question again because I think it's something that we should discuss and not forget about. So all I'm going to do today is give you a few snippets of what I fairly regularly remind folks of when they ask me to give a talk about soil health and drainage and cover crops and earthworms all together, is that basically drainage has an impact on soil health, and I'm going to give a few examples. So the summary of a much longer talk is that we need drainage for soil health as our first step. And of course, all of you folks know that, but that's often maybe not understood. Why? Because drainage affects cash crop growth and yields, as you all know, which means that affects carbon inputs into the soil, which feeds soil organisms and so on. It affects soil physical properties by the potential to improve those soil physical properties, and it affects things like cover crop growth, which is what I've spent a lot of attention on the last decade, and the potential to improve soil biology. So that's the summary. I'm going to give you just a few examples from my own work at CPAC. Many of you know that we have this long-term drainage site, 30 years plus old, down in southeastern Indiana. And when we started that study, most of you were familiar with the spacing experiment, but we had other experiments as well to look at certainly improving the drainage, but improving the soil physical properties on that poorly structured, low organic matter soil, reducing crusting and erosion, increasing infiltration and permeability. That was part of the original design of that second study, and certainly to improve crop growth and yield. So we found, of course, that drainage did, in fact, increase crop yields, but just a snippet of some of the other things that we looked at the time. We looked at earthworms, and we found that earthworms in general were higher with no-till than tilled, nothing to do with drainage. We found that earthworm populations were higher in tiled rather than untiled parts of the field where we had been studying that. And certainly we found that earthworms were higher where we had more food, where we had cover crops, where we had a longer term rotation, where we had manure versus just the control treatments. Soil physical properties also tended to be improved by those management practices that we implemented for that purpose, but also by having tiled versus untiled. So a couple of summary slides of many years of work. Our corn yields were increased where we had a tiled block versus an untiled block in the field by somewhere in the order of 16 to 25 bushels per acre, based on what the particular treatment was. Was it this long-term rotation? Was it manure application? Was it hay crop? Cover crops and rotation and manure had equal or greater corn yields than the control, no other agronomic treatment, where the field was tiled, and had equal or lower yields where the field was not tiled. Okay, so where we have a poorly drained soil, no tile, those agronomic management practices did not work very well. So a good drainage, the bottom line of that is a good drainage system is necessary as a first step if you want to improve overall soil physical properties, soil health, and those practices by themselves are not likely to make up for inadequate drainage. Again, when we used manure, we used cover crops, we used conservation tillage, we had a long-term rotation. We were able to improve soil properties when adequate drainage was present. So my bottom line to many of the folks that I talk to is that last point. as we talk with the public about improving soil health, we need to remind many of them that an adequate drainage system is a necessary first step, and we're not likely to improve soil health if it's a poorly drained soil and it doesn't have drainage. I hear often people say, and you all know that I work on no-till, I work on cover crops, I work on earthworms, big proponent of soil health, all that stuff, but I get people saying, you know, if we just grew cover crops and did no-till, we would not need drainage. That's a misunderstanding, in my opinion, right? Because if you have a high water table soil, you need drainage in order to have all those other things work. And we heard that from Wayne last night, those of you who were here, that we need drainage on our poorly drained soils. So I think that's just one important thing for us to keep in mind. So what I'd like to suggest is that, as you know, we're trying to not say one versus the other, right? Drainage or soil health practices. We're basically saying they're synergistic, and we need to deal with drainage issues before we can really fully improve soil health on soils that are poorly drained. So let me just suggest a few additional questions. And Jane had originally thought that we would have some potential for discussion and interaction with Wayne Honeycutt with the Soil Health Institute. He's not here, but I want to suggest still some things that we might be able to have a little bit of discussion on as part of this group. And then I'm going to introduce Sean, who will tell us about what he's doing and some needs that he has from this group. So I've just kind of made my case that drainage is necessary on poorly drained soils if you want to improve soil health. The question has come up with this group before about controlled drainage. And when you bring that water table back up for prolonged periods of time, is that going to be detrimental? And I have a lot of farmers who know I've worked on earthworms and say, what's it going to do to my earthworms? And we actually did, as part of our CIG project, we did some earthworm counts, the particular fields that we all were working on at that time. Many of them didn't happen to have a really high population of earthworms, so it wasn't a very good test. But I think that's still a valid question about what's the effect of controlled drainage on soil health, if it's too wet, too long. But maybe not so much just what's the effect, but how can we better manage it? I think we can say that it might be too wet, too long, but with some little tweaks, maybe we can change that, okay? So that would be a fruitful area for discussion as opposed to just fighting each other and saying it's either controlled drainage or soil health, okay? It's somewhere in between, probably. So can we manage that differently? Can we raise and lower the boards at different times, different depths? If we're managing it, can we try to optimize not only crop growth and water quality, which we've been talking about in this group for years, but also the soil health part? And just one example, if you're growing cover crops, and you're in Indiana and you raise the water table the 1st of November, that's probably too early if you're trying to grow cover crops. Maybe we don't raise the water table until the end of November, so we give the cover crops a little more time. And in the spring, maybe we lower the boards just a little earlier than we would if we were just looking at water quality, for example. And then the flip side of that is, okay, if we've improved soil health by other practices, does that necessarily mean that we have better water quality? And that's where I'm going to invite Sean up here in a minute. My opinion would be that if we improve soil health, yes, we have better water quality in the sense of sediment and sediment-bound nutrients or other constituents. We have less erosion if we have better soil health, greater infiltration. Better soil health doesn't necessarily mean a reduction in nitrate. And that's where I think we have sometimes the message gets a little blurred, that if we have better soil health, we have better water quality. Certain parts we do, certain parts maybe not, okay? For soil health, again, in my opinion, if you have cover crops growing, that's going to help on your nitrate. If you have better soil health because you've applied manure, maybe not. So I want to invite Sean Bloges, who's a postdoc with the Soil Health Institute, who basically I would like him to just briefly tell us about some of what his task is there, and I think he's also hoping that maybe some of you that have research projects on water quality would also provide an opportunity for him to measure soil health, but I'll let him tell him.
The last question there probably isn't, I couldn't have asked for a better lead-in for what I'm trying to do, so thanks. Yeah, so what we're trying to do is really see if, you know, these practices that people think are good for a lot of the properties that kind of define soil health, whether they really do improve or maybe even harm water quality. And that's kind of just to give you a little bit of an idea of what the Soil Health Institute does. We're really interested in how properties like aggregate stability, soil carbon, mineralizable nitrogen, things like that, how they impact other ecosystem services more broadly. But my project is kind of beginning by looking out or reaching out to other folks that are doing some kind of research or monitoring where you have a treatment versus a control, where you'd expect some kind of difference in a lot of soil health properties. Things like cover crops versus no cover crops, reduced tillage, alternative rotations, organic nitrogen sources. And we'd like to reach out to these places and look at not only the water quality differences, so nutrient loss in especially in tile drains. Our focus area is the upper Mississippi River Basin, but also runoff or leaching losses. Compare those differences and see if there's any corresponding differences in things like, again, aggregate stability, mineralizable nitrogen, things like that. But yeah, I'm glad I got to come here just because there's a lot of people in one room that might be doing that kind of research. So I'd love to talk to people that might be able to help find more sites like that. So thanks a lot.
So I think, if I understand, of many of you that have these drainage sites where you actually have different tests, I think Sean would be very interested in talking with you to find out about the possibility of sampling for soil health, and just kind of following up on that. So I don't know if we want to talk about any of these other questions.